4:30 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. The EA-18 Gulf Growler, call sign Viper 11, was banking through a slow, rhythmic orbit at 22,000 feet. The twin engines of the specialized electronic warfare aircraft hummed with a deceptive stability, a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the flight suits of the two-person crew. Beneath the canopy, the cockpit was a cramped world of glowing multifunction displays, and the soft, rhythmic clicking of cooling fans fighting the heat generated by the massive jamming pods slung beneath the wings. The mission was ostensibly a routine electronic surveillance flight, a standard presence mission to monitor the congested shipping lanes where the world's oil supply squeezed through, a narrow neck of water. But today, the data flowing into the aircraft's sensors was refusing to follow the script. The air inside the cockpit smelled of recycled oxygen and the faint, sharp scent of ozone, a byproduct of the high-voltage systems working at the edge of their capacity. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance, the electronic warfare officer in the rear seat, adjusted the gain on her primary tactical display. Her eyes, strained from 4 hours of staring at monochromatic data, tracked a series of anomalous pulses. For the last 20 minutes, the ALQ-218 tactical jamming receiver had been flickering with a low-priority warning light. It was a strange, indistinct signal, a sensor ghost, that appeared as a soft, blurred ring on her screen. Every time she tried to lock a digital fingerprint onto the source, the signal dissolved into background noise. Viper 11, this is Pilot. Captain Elias Miller's voice crackled over the internal communications loop. I am seeing a slight deviation in the terrain following radar. Are you pushing something out of the pods that I should know about? Negative. Elias, Vance replied, her gloved fingers dancing across the keypad to isolate the frequency. The jamming pods are in standby, but I have got a recurring anomaly at 10 o'clock low. It is centered right over that cluster of commercial DHOWs near the southern shipping lane. It looks like industrial interference, but the waveform is too clean. It is acting like a localized dead zone. This was the signature element that would define the next hour. The sensor ghost was not a malfunction of the aircraft, but the result of a specific physical reality. On the water below, tucked beneath the canvas tarps of a seemingly rusted civilian transport vessel, were 3 industrial-grade microwave emitters, illegally modified to flood the immediate airspace with a specific, low-energy resonant frequency. It was not enough to trigger a standard radar warning receiver, but it was perfectly tuned to create a blind spot in the Growler's automated threat library prioritization. To the aircraft's sophisticated computers, the ship below was invisible, masked by what appeared to be a harmless atmospheric quirk. The United States Fifth Fleet Electronic Warfare Assessment, dated 48 hours prior, had assessed all civilian maritime traffic in the northern sector as presenting a negligible threat profile with no capability for offensive electronic interference. That specific assessment sat at the top of the mission file, a digital assurance that the crew had reviewed before takeoff. Based on that intelligence, the blurred rings on Vance's screen were categorized as Category 4 environmental clutter. Outside the cockpit, the environment was a study in gray and black. The stars were beginning to drown in a thick, humid haze that rose from the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. The horizon was non-existent, a seamless transition from the dark sky to the oily black of the sea. Below them, the lights of the massive tankers looked like stationary stars, their wakes invisible in the pre-dawn gloom. The only movement was the steady, hypnotic sweep of the Growler's wings against the thin air. The unanswered question that lingered in the cockpit was why the clutter seemed to be moving in tandem with the aircraft's orbit. Every time Miller banked the EA-18 Gulf to begin a new leg of the surveillance track, the blurred ring on the tactical display shifted just enough to remain between the aircraft and the civilian vessel below. Vance felt a prickle of sweat run down the back of her neck, underneath the collar of her flight suit. The electronic warfare suite was designed to dominate the electromagnetic spectrum, to blind integrated air defense networks, and render enemy radars useless. It was the apex predator of the digital battlefield. Yet, In the silence of the cockpit, surrounded by millions of dollars of cutting-edge technology, she felt a growing sense of exposure. The dead zone on her screen was growing, larger, and for the first time in her career, the most advanced electronic warfare platform in the world was flying blind over a target it had been told to ignore. The Strait of Hormuz is a geographic choke point only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, a maritime funnel, through which nearly 20% of the world's petroleum liquids pass daily. In the pre-dawn hours of this Tuesday in 2026, the waterway was a dense grid of slow-moving steel. Tankers the size of skyscrapers moved with agonizing slowness through the designated transit lanes, their hulls deep in the water, while hundreds of smaller wooden dhows and fiberglass speedboats darted between them like insects. The United States Air Force had maintained a constant presence in this sector for 3 weeks, following a series of anonymous cyber attacks against regional desalination plants. The EA-18 Gulf Growler was the cornerstone of this presence. It was tasked with providing a protective electronic umbrella, ensuring that any attempt to target commercial shipping with radar-guided missiles would be met with an instantaneous wall of digital noise. The 5th Fleet Intelligence Directorate Maritime Threat Assessment, received 48 hours prior, had assessed the risk of surface-to-air threats from civilian maritime vessels in the southern corridor as non-existent due to the heavy international naval presence and the lack of visible weapon mounts on monitored dhows. This specific intelligence document had categorized the vessel currently beneath Viper 11, a 60-foot wooden DHOW named the Al Mirage, as a low-interest commercial transport likely carrying legitimate cargo between the United Arab Emirates and the northern ports. On the deck of the Al Mirage, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and rotting fish. The crew were not uniformed soldiers, they were mercenaries, dressed in salt-stained civilian tunics and heavy boots, moving with a disciplined silence that belied their outward appearance. They did not communicate via radio, which they knew the aircraft above would intercept. Instead, they used hand signals, illuminated briefly by the dim red glow of a handheld GPS unit. Tied down under a heavy, sun-bleached canvas tarp, near the stern was the source of the signature element that was currently baffling the Growler's sensors. 3 industrial-grade microwave emitters, scavenged from a decommissioned medical waste sterilization plant, were wired into a series of heavy-duty marine batteries. The emitters were pointed upward, their beams focused into a narrow, vertical cone. This was not a weapon intended to destroy the aircraft, but a specific tool of deception. The microwave energy was vibrating at a frequency that mimicked the atmospheric resonance of a heavy rain squall, a phenomenon the Growler's software was programmed to filter out to prevent sensor saturation. By creating this localized dead zone, the crew of the Al Mirage had achieved something that a billion-dollar integrated air defense system could not. They had made the immediate vicinity of their ship a blind spot for the most advanced electronic warfare platform in the world. While the mercenaries adjusted the angle of the emitters, a man at the bow of the ship slowly raised a Russian-made 90K-38 Igla-S man-portable air defense system. He did not use the launcher's integrated radar, which would have triggered the Growler's defensive alarms. Instead, he waited for a visual sighting through the haze, relying on the fact that the aircraft was flying a predictable, rhythmic orbit. Up in the cockpit of Viper 11, the 2 officers were operating under the belief that the water below was a safe zone. The air conditioning hissed, a constant white noise that masked the subtle change in the engine pitch as Miller banked the aircraft for its 7th pass over the DHOW cluster. The heat from the electronic warfare pods began to soak through the airframe, a reminder of the massive amounts of energy being projected into the empty sky miles away from the silent threat on the water. The intelligence assessment had predicted a calm morning with 0 hostile activity. As the Growler leveled its wings at 22,000 feet, the pilot checked his fuel state and looked toward the eastern horizon, where a faint, bruised purple line indicated the coming dawn. They were 5 minutes away from completing their station time and returning to the carrier. The electronic ghosts on Vance's screen remained blurred and indistinct, categorized by the computer as harmless noise from a world that the intelligence brief had promised was at peace. At 5:15 in the morning, the EA-18 Golf Growler was 3 minutes away from its scheduled egress point. The aircraft was maintaining a steady airspeed of 350 knots, its nose pointed toward the open water of the Arabian Sea. Inside the cockpit, the lighting was dialed down to a deep, crimson glow to preserve the crew's night vision, casting long, flickering shadows against the carbon fiber panels. Captain Elias Miller rested his left hand lightly on the throttles, feeling the immense power of the two General Electric F-404 engines through his flight glove. The air outside was a soup of thick humidity and salt, but inside the pressurized capsule, the environment was sterile and dry. The only scent was the faint, metallic tang of the oxygen system, and the lingering smell of the coffee Miller had finished an hour ago. "Vance, how is our ghost looking?" Miller asked, his voice steady, over the intercom. He tilted his head to the left, peering through the thick plexiglass of the canopy toward the dark cluster of vessels, 4 miles below. In the rear seat, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance was wrestling with her sensor suite. The 3 industrial microwave emitters on the DHOW below were continuing to flood her receivers with a precisely modulated waveform. On her display, the tactical situation map was cluttered with what the computer identified as atmospheric interference, a blooming, shifting cloud of digital noise that seemed to follow the aircraft's movement with unsettling precision. "The dead zone is still active, Elias," Vance replied, her brow furrowed as she toggled through the different radar modes. "It is localized, maybe 2 miles in diameter. The system is still tagging it as environmental clutter, but it is too consistent. It is almost like we are looking through a sheet of frosted glass right over the southern shipping lane." The United States Fifth Fleet Intelligence Assessment, which they had briefed before the engines were even started, had specifically stated that there were no electronic warfare capabilities present within the civilian maritime fleet. This assessment was the primary reason Vance had not yet requested a more aggressive investigation of the DAO cluster. According to the intelligence brief, the ship below was a harmless transport, incapable of even basic radar jamming, let alone the sophisticated frequency manipulation required to mask a missile launch. Vance checked the AN/SPY-6 radar data being data-linked from a nearby destroyer, the DDG-51 class ship USS Mason. Even the destroyer's powerful Aegis combat system was failing to flag the DHOW as a threat. The ship was simply too small, its wooden hull providing a negligible radar cross-section that the software dismissed as sea spray and wave crests. The signature element of the microwave emitters had effectively partitioned the reality of the battlefield. On the bridge of the aircraft carrier and in the operations center in Bahrain, the morning was progressing without incident, but in the rear seat of Viper 11, Vance felt a growing, icy dread. The rules of DOT engagement required a positive identification of a hostile act or hostile intent before any defensive measures could be taken, and right now, all she had were a few blurred rings on a screen and a gut feeling that the intelligence brief was dangerously wrong. The heat from jamming pods under the wings was radiating through the fuselage, a physical weight that seemed to press against the airframe. The aircraft felt heavy, loaded with electronic weapons that were currently pointed at ghosts. Miller began a gentle bank to the right, a routine maneuver to stay within the designated patrol box. As the Growler's wing dipped, the cockpit canopy reflected the first hint of light from the rising sun. A thin, jagged line of orange cutting through the haze. 2 minutes to egress, Miller said, his eyes scanning the primary flight display. Let's get this thing home. The silence in the cockpit was absolute, broken only by the low-frequency hum of the electronics and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the 2 officers into their masks. They were at the most vulnerable point of their mission, relaxed, low on fuel, and convinced that the dark water below held nothing but commerce. The microwave dead zone remained locked on their position, a digital shroud that ensured that when the strike finally came, the aircraft's billion-dollar brain would see only a clear, empty sky. The port engine of Viper 1-1 vanished in a white-hot eruption of titanium shards and burning kerosene before the cockpit alarms could register a single pulse of danger. The impact tore through the fuselage just behind the rear seat, the force of the blast throwing Lieutenant Commander Vance's head forward against the tactical display with enough violence to crack the glass. 3 seconds earlier, a 90K-38 Igla-S missile had been streaking upward from the bow of the Al Mirage, its infrared seeker locked onto the heat signature of the left engine. It had traveled from the deck to the aircraft in less than 8 seconds, hidden from the Growler's sensors by the localized microwave dead zone that had masked the launch flare. Captain Miller felt the aircraft lurch into a violent, uncontrolled roll to the left as the shockwave of the detonation hammered into the airframe. The sound, a horrific, metallic shriek of tearing aluminum that drowned out the cockpit's internal cooling fans. He fought the control stick with both hands, his muscles straining against the hydraulic failure as the smell of acrid electrical fire and vaporized hydraulic fluid filled his mask. The aircraft began a terminal tumble toward the dark water of the strait, leaving a jagged trail of black smoke and glittering debris that drifted in the humid air for 10 seconds before the first ejection seat fired into the pre-dawn sky. The sudden disappearance of the Growler's data link caused a momentary freeze on the bridge of the destroyer USS Mason, located 12 miles to the southwest. The tactical action officer stared at the screen where the friendly icon for Viper 1-1 had been replaced by a blinking amber loss of contact symbol. The radar operators on the destroyer scrambled to adjust their gain, but they saw nothing in the sky over the DOA cluster. The 5th Fleet Intelligence Assessment, which had deemed this sector safe from surface-to-air threats, was now a useless document, as the reality of a shootdown became clear through the physical absence of a $67 million aircraft. The ejecting crew felt the massive hammer blow of the rocket motors beneath their seats. Vance was the first to go, the canopy shattering in a rain of plexiglass before her seat punched through the slipstream. The cold morning air hit her like a solid wall at 350 knots, the smell of jet fuel and salt spray instantly replacing the acrid cockpit smoke. 4 seconds later, Miller followed, his seat clearing the disintegrating airframe just moments before the Growler's main fuel cells erupted in a secondary fireball that bleached the dark sky white for a full second. The 2 parachutes deployed automatically, white silk blossoming, against the purple pre-dawn. Below them, the EA-18 Golf Growler slammed into the water with a dull, heavy thud that sent a column of white water 60 feet into the air. The wreckage began to sink immediately, the heavy engines pulling the shattered fuselage into the deep silt of the strait. The signature element of the microwave emitters on the DHOW had done its job. Even as the aircraft hit the water, the emitters remained active, continuing to flood the crash site with the resonant frequency that confused the search radars of the nearby fleet. To the Aegis combat system on the USS Mason, the crash site looked like a patch of heavy rain, a weather anomaly that hid the 2 pilots as they drifted toward the oily black water. On the bridge of the USS Mason, the commanding officer issued the command for battle stations. The ship's engines surged, the hull shuddering, as the 4 gas turbine engines pushed the destroyer toward 30 knots. The rescue was no longer a routine task. It was a race against time and an adversary that had just proven it could hide in plain sight. Using industrial scrap and a wrong intelligence assessment, Miller hit the water first. The impact was jarring, the salt water cold and tasting of fuel. He struggled to release his parachute harness as the heavy silk threatened to pull him under. He looked up and saw Vance's chute, drifting 300 yards to the east, closer to the DHOW cluster. The Al Mirage was already turning, its engines churning the water, as it moved toward the downed aircrew. The silence of the morning was gone, replaced by the roar of the destroyer's engines in the distance. 5:22 in the morning. The Combat Information Center aboard the destroyer USS Mason was a hive of controlled, high-stakes activity, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and the low-frequency hum of high-powered computing racks. The blue-tinted lighting, of the room cast a ghostly pallor over the faces of the 30 sailors manning the consoles. The commanding officer of the USS Mason stood behind the tactical action officer, his eyes fixed on the primary air and surface search display. The loss of contact marker for Viper 1-1 remained static at coordinates 26 degrees 31 minutes north, 55 degrees 55 minutes east. The destroyer was currently 4 miles from the last known position of the EA-18 Gulf Growler, cutting through the swells at 32 knots. The vibration of the 4 gas turbine engines was a constant, bone-deep shudder that rattled the coffee mugs in their gimbals. Tactical. Give me a updated picture on that DHOW cluster, the commanding officer ordered, his voice low but carrying through the tension of the room. Sir, the ANSPY-6 radar is still struggling with the return, the tactical action officer replied, tapping a sequence into his console. The microwave interference we detected earlier has intensified. It is creating a localized atmospheric bloom. We have a solid fix on the largest vessel, the Al Mirage, but it is surrounded by a cloud of digital clutter. We cannot confirm if they have picked up the pilots. The search and rescue operation, designated as the primary objective by the United States 5th Fleet Command in Bahrain, was now operating under a cloud of tactical uncertainty. The 5th Fleet Intelligence Assessment that had been the basis for the morning's mission, the document that had dismissed the civilian fleet as a non-threat, was being treated as a failed premise. The commanding officer knew that every second the pilots spent in the water was a second they were vulnerable to capture by the same mercenaries who had shot them down. On the flight deck of the USS Mason, the air was a chaotic swirl of salt spray and the screaming whine of a turbine engine. The search and rescue helicopter, an MH-60 Sierra call sign Rescue 7-1, was at high hot ready. The flight deck crew, dressed in their color-coded jerseys, moved with practiced, mechanical efficiency despite the ship's heavy pitching in the wake of its own high-speed turn. Rescue 7-1. You are cleared for immediate launch, the air boss called from the primary flight control tower. The wind is 30 knots from the northwest. The deck is green. The MH-60 Sierra lifted off the deck at 5:28, its rotors biting into the humid air and kicking up a massive cloud of spray. The helicopter banked sharply to the east, heading toward the coordinates of the crash. Inside the cabin, the 2 rescue swimmers were already checking their gear flippers, masks, and the heavy hoisting harnesses. The acrid smell of burnt aviation fuel from the earlier crash still hung in the air, drifting over the water like a physical memory of the loss. As the helicopter transitioned to forward flight, the crew activated the multispectral targeting system. Even from 3 miles away, the signature element of the microwave emitters was visible to their sensors. It appeared as a shimmering, heat-distorted column rising from the DHOW Al Mirage, a vertical finger of energy that confused the helicopter's laser rangefinder. Mason, this is Rescue 7-1. The pilot's voice came through the destroyer's radio. We are seeing significant electronic interference over the objective area. It is affecting our navigation sensors. We are going to have to execute a visual-only approach. We have eyes on 2 strobes in the water. They are roughly 400 meters apart. The tactical situation report being relayed to the 7th Fleet Command was grim. The United States Navy was now attempting a recovery in the middle of a dead zone created by industrial scrap against an enemy that the intelligence community had assessed as non-existent. The destroyer's 5-inch gun was trained on the Al Mirage, but the rules of engagement remained restrictive. Until the pilots were secured or the DOAA committed a second hostile act, the USS Mason was a silent observer to a race that was being won by a wooden boat. The environment around the crash site was a study in growing chaos. The sun was now high enough to turn the sky a bruised, angry orange, illuminating the jagged pieces of carbon fiber and white insulation that bobbed on the surface. Between the wreckage, the 2 white parachutes of the aircrew looked like discarded tissue paper, slowly being drawn toward the dark hull of the approaching civilian vessel. 5:32 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. Captain Elias Miller was bobbing in a sea of oily black glass, the 78-degree water, a lukewarm shock against the adrenaline-fueled heat of his body. His survival vest, a heavy assembly of nylon and specialized equipment, felt like an anchor until the dual carbon dioxide canisters fired, inflating the fluorescent orange bladders around his neck. The silence of the open water was absolute, a staggering contrast to the mechanical screaming of the cockpit just minutes prior. The only sound was the rhythmic, hollow slap of the swells against his flight helmet and the distant, muffled roar of the destroyers. Engines, still miles away. "Vance! Sarah! Give me a whistle!" Miller shouted, his voice sounding thin and fragile in the vastness of the strait. He reached into his vest, his fingers fumbling with the waterproof seal of his survival kit, to retrieve the high-intensity strobe light. 50 yards to his east, a rhythmic splashing answered him. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance was struggling against the heavy silk of her parachute, which had draped over her like a suffocating white shroud. The salt water had already soaked into her flight suit, adding 30 pounds of weight to every movement. She had managed to kick free of her boots to stay buoyant, but the shroud lines were tangled around her survival beacon, preventing the automated distress signal from reaching the overhead satellites. The environment was thick with the acrid chemical stink of vaporized hydraulic fluid that had settled on the surface of the water in a shimmering, iridescent film. The air carried the sharp, metallic taste of the explosion, a lingering reminder of the $67 million aircraft that was now settling into the silt 200 feet below them. The civilian vessel, the DHOW named Al Mirage, was now less than 100 yards away and closing steadily. From his low vantage point at the waterline, Miller could see the dark, weathered wood of the hull rising above him like a cliff face. The ship moved with a predatory grace, its engine muffled by a specialized underwater exhaust system that suppressed its acoustic signature. High on the stern of the DHOW, the signature element of the mission remained active. The 3 industrial microwave emitters were still vibrating, with high-energy pulses, creating a shimmering veil of ionized air around the vessel. This electronic shroud was doing more than just confusing the destroyer's radar. It was now actively interfering with the MH-60 Sierra helicopter's infrared sensors. To the pilots of the rescue helicopter, the DHOW appeared as a massive, indistinct heat bloom, making it impossible to distinguish the hull of the boat from the 2 pilots in the water. On the deck of the Al Mirage, the mercenaries were moving with the cold efficiency of professional abductors. They did not shout. They did not wave. 2 men, in dark civilian tunics, stood at the rail, uncoiling a heavy nylon boarding ladder, while a third man readied a long-handled boat hook. They were not interested in the wreckage of the EA-18 Gulf Growler. They were interested in the 2 United States Navy officers, whose survival would provide a geopolitical leverage far more valuable than the scrap metal at the bottom of the sea. Miller reached for his service pistol, the Sig Sauer M18, but his movements were slowed by the resistance of the water. He knew the lifeboat protocol by heart. Avoid capture at all costs, utilize the environment for concealment, and wait for the quick reaction force. But there was no concealment in the open water of the strait as the sun began to crest the horizon, turning the sea into a blinding sheet of orange light. "Sarah, swim away from the hull," Miller yelled, seeing the DHOW begin to bank toward his partner. "They are trying to box us in." Vance finally sliced through the last of the parachute lines with her survival knife, her breathing ragged and heavy. She looked up at the towering wooden bow of the Al Mirage, seeing the mercenary with the boat hook leaning over the side. The man's face was obscured by a dark scarf, his eyes fixed on her with a detached, clinical focus. The rescue helicopter, Rescue 7-1, was now less than 2 miles away, its searchlights cutting through the haze. But the microwave interference was causing the helicopter's flight control computers to register dozens of false collision warnings, forcing the pilot to hover at a distance rather than committing to a low-altitude recovery. The intelligence failure was now a physical barrier. The United States Navy had the firepower and the technology to dominate the region. But in this 100-yard circle of water, they were being outmaneuvered by a wooden boat and 3 stolen industrial magnets. Miller felt the hull of the DHOW graze his shoulder, the rough wood scraping against his flight suit. He looked up and saw the dark barrel of an AK-47 pointed down at him. The mercenary, at the rail, gestured toward the boarding ladder. The choice was absolute: climb the ladder or be shredded by the DHOW's propellers. The silence of the morning had been replaced by the low, guttural throb of the DHOW's engine, and the realization that the most sophisticated electronic warfare crew in the world was about to become the property of a nameless merchant ship. 5:35 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. Lieutenant Commander Jack Russo, the pilot of the MH-60 Sierra helicopter callsign Rescue 71, slammed his hand against the master caution reset button for the 4th time in 60 seconds. The cockpit was a symphony of discordant warnings. The primary flight display flickered with ghost contacts, and the radar altimeter was jumping between 50 feet and 2,000 feet, as the microwave energy from the DHOW Mirage flooded the helicopter's avionics suite. The signature element of the industrial microwave emitters was now creating a physical barrier to the rescue, a wall of electronic noise that the Fifth Fleet Intelligence Assessment had claimed was impossible for a civilian vessel to generate. "The hell with the computer," Russo growled into his mask, his knuckles white as he gripped the collective. "I am going to manual override. Co-pilot, give me the searchlight and stay on the night vision goggles. We are flying this one dirty." Russo tilted the nose of the 10-ton helicopter down, the 2 T-700 engines screaming as he pushed the aircraft into a steep, aggressive descent toward the water. He ignored the collision warnings screaming in his ears, relying on his eyes and his experience to judge the distance to the waves. The air outside the cockpit was a swirling vortex of salt spray and the orange glow of the rising sun, which was now casting long, jagged shadows across the surface of the strait. 50 yards from the downed aircrew, the mercenaries on the deck of the Al Mirage were seconds away from dragging Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance onto their deck. The man with the boat hook had successfully snagged the collar of her survival vest, the heavy wooden pole pulling her toward the churning wake of the DHOW. "Viper. 1-1. Stay low." Russo's voice thundered over the helicopter's external loudspeaker, the sound cutting through the roar of the engines. On the starboard side of the helicopter, Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Thorne kicked the M240 Bravo machine gun onto its mount. He didn't wait for a computer-calculated firing solution. He sighted down the barrel, his eyes tracking the dark silhouettes on the DHOW's deck. The acrid stink of burnt gunpowder and hot oil filled the cabin. As he pulled the trigger, the 7.62mm rounds stitching a line of white geysers across the water just feet from the DHOA's hull. The suppression was immediate. The mercenary at the rail dropped the boat hook and dove for cover behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. The heavy lead rounds tore through the DHOW's wooden bulwarks, sending splinters of ancient teak flying like shrapnel. One of the rounds punched directly into the stern-mounted battery array that powered the microwave emitters. A sharp blue electrical arc erupted from the stern of the DHOW, followed by a plume of thick, oily white smoke. Instantly, the electronic dead zone began to collapse. On the bridge of the USS Mason, 12 miles away, the tactical action officer saw the blurred rings on his screen sharpen into a clear, distinct contact. The AN/SPY-6 radar finally achieved a hard lock on the Al Mirage. "Mason has a track," the tactical officer announced, his voice crackling with a newfound intensity. "The interference is dropping. Launching the interceptor boat now." At the midship station of the destroyer, the heavy mechanical arms of the boat davit swung outward. The 7-meter rigid hull inflatable boat, carrying an 8-man visit, board, search, and seizure team, hit the water with a heavy slap. The boat's twin 250 horsepower outboard engines roared to life, the high-performance hull leaping over the swells at 45 knots. The team, dressed in black tactical kits, and carrying M4 carbines, moved with a lethal, synchronized purpose. Back at the crash site, the MH-60 Sierra was now hovering just 20 feet above the water, its rotor wash creating a massive, circular depression in the sea that pushed the DHOW back. The heat from the helicopter's exhaust washed over the pilots, a blast of dry air that smelled of burnt kerosene. "Thorne, keep them pinned down!" Russo shouted over the internal loop. "Swimmers, go, go, go!" Two rescue swimmers in black neoprene suits rolled out of the cabin door, hitting the water with precise, streamlined entries. They swam toward the pilots with powerful, rhythmic strokes, ignoring the DHOW that was still less than 50 yards away. The environment was a chaotic blend of sensory extremes: the deafening roar of the helicopter, the sharp, staccato bark of the machine gun, and the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the water. The air was thick with the smell of the ocean, the acrid smoke from the DHOW's damaged electronics, and the sharp chemical bite of the tracer rounds. The mercenaries on the Al-Mirage tried to return fire, a single burst of AK-47 fire, sparking against the helicopter's armored belly, but they were outmatched. The heavy suppression from the MH-60 Sierra and the sight of the destroyer's interceptor boat screaming toward them at 45 knots broke their resolve. The DHOW began to turn, its engines straining as it attempted to flee back toward the congested shipping lanes, leaving a trail of debris and the sinking wreckage of the $67 million Growler behind. The tactical retaliation was successful, but the cost was already etched into the morning. The United States Navy had been forced into a desperate manual rescue because their billion-dollar sensors had been blinded by a threat that the intelligence brief had said did not exist. The pilots were in reach, but the mission's primary objective, maintaining a seamless, invisible electronic umbrella, had been shattered by a wooden boat and a handful of mercenaries. 5:42 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. The rescue hoist on the MH-60 Sierra helicopter hummed with a strained, mechanical whine as it drew Captain Elias Miller out of the black water. He was suspended in the air, spinning slowly in the rotor wash, his flight suit plastered to his body by the weight of the sea. The salt spray was a constant, stinging needle prick against his skin, and the air was thick with the smell of burnt aviation fuel and the ozone still lingering from the destroyed microwave emitters. Above him, the rescue swimmer signaled with a thumbs up, illuminated by the flickering green light of the helicopter's interior. "Viper 1-1 pilot is aboard," the crew chief announced over the radio, his voice a steady drone against the roar of the twin engines. 30 yards to the west, the second hoist was already descending for Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance. She was being held steady by the second swimmer, her face pale under the orange glare of the rising sun, but her eyes alert. The environment was a chaotic churn of white water and spray, the surface of the strait littered with glittering shards of the Growler's carbon fiber fuselage. Each piece of wreckage hissed as it cooled in the water, a funeral chorus for the $67 million aircraft. While the aircrew was being recovered, the rigid hull inflatable boat from the USS Mason reached the DHOW Al-Mirage. The 8-man visit, board, search, and seizure team did not hesitate. They brought the high-performance boat alongside the wooden hull at 20 knots, the impact of the rubber collar against the teak sounding like a muffled drumbeat. The team scrambled over the rail with suppressed M4 carbines at the ready, their boots thudding against the deck. The mercenaries on the DHOW offered no further resistance. They were found huddled near the midship crates, their hands raised, their faces illuminated by the harsh white beam of the team leader's tactical light. Near the stern, the 3 industrial microwave emitters were a twisted mass of blackened copper and melted plastic, the signature element of their deception now reduced to scrap metal by the machine gun fire from the helicopter. The deck was slick with hydraulic fluid and salt water, and the air carried the acrid, chemical stink of the short-circuited batteries. "Mason, this is boarding Team 1, the team leader reported, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Vessel is secure. We have 5 detainees. We are identifying multiple industrial-grade emitters and a spent 90K-38 missile tube, requesting instructions for scuttling." The response from the destroyer was immediate and clinical. The United States Navy had no intention of towing the hostile vessel back to port, where it could become a diplomatic complication. Boarding Team 1. Extract and clear the area, the commanding officer of the USS Mason ordered. We are going to sanitize the site. The boarding team moved with lethal speed, stripping the DHOW of its GPS units and any loose intelligence, before bailing back into their inflatable boat. They pushed off and throttled up, the twin outboard engines screaming as they cleared the zone. At 5:55 in the morning, the 5-inch gun on the bow of the USS Mason adjusted its elevation by a fraction of a degree. The sound of the shot was a single, bone-shaking crack that echoed across the water for miles. The high-explosive round struck the Al Mirage just above the waterline, right where the engine was mounted. The DHOW did not just sink, it disintegrated. A column of orange fire and white steam erupted from the hull, followed by the sound of ancient wood shattering into thousands of splinters. The microwave emitters, the missile launcher, and the false cargo were all consumed, in a single, violent flash. 10 seconds later, the only thing left of the Al Mirage was a patch of bubbling, oily water and a few charred pieces of timber bobbing in the swells. On board the MH-60 Sierra, Miller and Vance were wrapped in heavy wool blankets, their teeth chattering despite the humid air. They watched through the open cabin door as the smoke from the DHO drifted toward the horizon. The rescue was complete, and the hostile platform was destroyed. The tactical objective had been achieved, and the threat had been neutralized. But as the helicopter banked toward the distant, gray silhouette of the aircraft carrier, the silence in the cabin was heavy. The signature element that had nearly cost them their lives, a handful of scavenged industrial parts, had proven that the most advanced military technology in the world could be blinded by an enemy who knew where the gaps were. The intelligence failure was absolute, and the black smoke rising from the water was a grim marker of the price paid for that mistake. 6:30 in the morning. The flight deck of the United States Navy aircraft carrier was a vast, wind-swept expanse of gray steel, illuminated by the low, harsh light of a sun that had finally cleared the horizon. The MH-60 Sierra helicopter Rescue 7-1 touched down with a heavy, mechanical jar that vibrated through the deck plates. The rotors were still spinning, creating a deafening whirlwind of salt air and jet exhaust, as the search and rescue swimmers helped Captain Elias Miller and Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance onto the non-skid surface. They were met by a team of medical personnel in white jerseys, their faces grim and focused. The mission was over, but there was no celebratory atmosphere on the flight deck. The environment was one of clinical, somber efficiency. The air smelled of burnt grease and the ozone of a dying storm, mixed with the sharp, medicinal scent of the triage kits. Captain Miller walked with a stiff, labored gait, his arm draped over the shoulder of a corpsman. Lieutenant Commander Vance was on a stretcher, her eyes closed against the glare of the morning sun. The impact of her head against the tactical display during the shootdown had left her with a severe concussion and a deep laceration across her brow. She was the first casualty of a conflict that the United States Fifth Fleet Intelligence Assessment, written only 2 days prior, had claimed would not happen. That document had assessed the civilian traffic in the Strait as a negligible risk, a prediction that had been systematically dismantled by the reality of a shoulder-fired missile and a wooden boat. In the carrier's maintenance bays, the logistics of the loss were already being calculated. 1 EA-18 Gulf Growler, airframe number 168-657, was officially stricken from the rolls. The loss represented more than $67 million in hardware, but the true cost was the destruction of the aircraft's specialized electronic warfare suite, the ALQ-218 receivers, and the high-band jamming pods that had been tuned to protect the fleet. The signature element of the engagement, the industrial microwave emitters, was now being analyzed by the ship's electronic warfare technicians using the data bursts Vance had managed to transmit before the impact. They looked at the blurred rings on the saved files, the dead zone that had turned a billion-dollar sensor suite into a liability. The technicians spoke in low, hushed tones, realizing that the technology used to bring down the Growler had been scavenged from a medical waste plant. As the two officers were moved toward the medical lift, the scale of the failure began to settle over the command staff. The United States Navy had maintained its presence, and the pilots had been recovered. But the invisible umbrella of electronic dominance had been pierced by the most primitive of means. The final 15% of the day's report would not focus on the destruction of the Al-Mirage or the successful rescue. It would focus on the fragility of the machine. The EA-18 Gulf Growler was a marvel of engineering, a pinnacle of digital warfare designed to fight in a world of high-tech adversaries. Yet, it had been brought down by a frequency used to sterilize hospital bandages, manipulated by men who did not appear on any satellite watch list. War is often described as a clash of grand strategies, but, in the silence of the carrier's medical ward, it was revealed as a series of physical subtractions. It was the subtraction of a $67 million airframe from the carrier's deck. It was the subtraction of 3 months of flight readiness for a pilot who now flinched at the sound of a cooling fan. Most specifically, it was the subtraction of the certainty that technology alone could provide safety. The last image of the morning was not the destroyer's 5-inch gun firing in triumph, but the empty space on the flight deck, where Viper 11 should have been parked. The grease-stained deck where the aircraft's tires had rested for 2 weeks was now just a patch of bare, cold metal being scrubbed clean by a sailor who did not look up as the next strike package began to turn their engines. The mission was technically a success, but the cost was a permanent jagged edge in the fleet's confidence. A reminder that in the narrow waters of the strait, the most dangerous ghost is the one the intelligence brief tells you to ignore.